Every day, something dramatic happens in the Caribbean that affects our lives. We'll give you the details. We'll give you the facts on Caribbean Perspective with Eddie Frederick. Here's Eddie Frederick.
So glad you can join us. New perspectives shared on a profitable LIAT going forward. This story takes the lead in our 926th edition of Caribbean Perspective for Monday, 24th August 2020. Details after this important message.
The hurricane season is now upon us, so we as Caribbean people need to remember to think safety and be prepared. Avoid venturing outside during a storm or hurricane, especially if there are strong winds. Rooftops and other debris are often blown about and can cause great damage.
Welcome back. Newly appointed LIAT Administrator Cleveland Seaforth is giving his perspectives on how a restructured carrier can become financially sustainable. Sherilyn Beezer of ABS News has this story.
LIAT Administrator Cleveland Seaforth highlights one area which will need attention to make the airline sustainable.
Part of the problem is that the fare that you paid carried a very high component of taxes to the governments. And that obviously affected the number of persons who traveled in the region, right? And I think that going forward, it's a matter which the governments are going to have to take on board.
Seaforth says another aspect of a resilient LIAT going forward is getting the staff ratio right. This is necessary due to the inherent cost structure of operating an airline.
LIAT operates in an industry which is capital intensive, labor intensive, and it's highly regulated. And those three things by itself add a lot of costs to the operation.
He explains how the airline can ensure all these areas are managed to redound to its future success.
If we have a private sector investor who comes on board along with the government, right? And we have those funds put into a new entity, right? I would expect that the management of the new entity would determine the direction they want to go in and the levels of staffing, the aircraft they would fly, the routes they would fly.
Seaforth says LIAT is one of the few symbols of Caribbean integration and urges the new management to retain the name. Sherilyn Beezer reporting for ABS News.
Over now to Guyana, where speaking on Kaicho Radio's Guyana's Oil and You, Vice President Dr. Barrett Jagdeo said that Guyanese are disadvantaged when it comes to the local content and this needs to be addressed quickly. To this end, the Vice President said engagements will take place with the ExxonMobil oil giant soon. Here is HGP's Wendell Badri with this report.
In an exclusive radio interview on Kaicho Radio with senior journalist Kiana Wilberg, Vice President Barra Jagdeo has said that his party has made it clear to ExxonMobil that it intends to pass local content legislation which will address pressing issues to the business community and households across Guyana. The Vice President said that his party believes enough is not being done to ensure Guyanese benefit from the development of the country's oil bounty. Mr. Jagdeo further iterated that the government plans to hold consultations with the oil company very soon.
It's not just in negotiation. We're a consultation with the public. We plan to set up a working group. That's why we reached out to Dr. Paul, because we know he did some seminal work in this regard. And then once we've come up with positions that will ensure that our people are treated in an equal manner.
The Vice President, who posited that some foreigners have an unfair advantage over Guyanese, since they are allowed duty-free concessions and can also use that privilege to bid for other contracts at costs lower than the locals, which amounts to Guyanese doing the same work, but earning less.
It is for all their subcontractors. So Exxon could easily say, well, I've subcontracted the work out, and therefore that's not my responsibility. They will have a responsibility to ensure that their subcontractors also observe rigidly the provisions of the legislation in relation to local content.
Mr. Jagdeo stated that legislation only will not solve the problem, but there also needs to be the relevant means of enforcing the legislation.
So once you have legislation, you have to have put in place the means of enforcing the legislation. And that is why we need a capability in government that will ensure that every provision of the contracts going forward, that those are observed by the companies involved. This includes auditing of local content costs and to see whether the components of those costs are properly classified.
The Vice President, when asked about cost sharing between the country and the oil companies, stated that in considering cost sharing, there needs to be stringent audits by the country to ensure that the costs submitted match industry standards.
So how do we know that these are real costs? So it's not just what constitutes recoverable costs. It is also auditing all the costs, the submission on all costs. So to see whether they meet industry standards, etc. So that is a vital part of our plan going forward.
When questioned about how his government intends to address the issue of corruption in the sector, Mr. Jagdeo explained that
under the new government, we moved to more technical agencies performing more of the tasks with the oil companies. So minimizing the contacts between the politicians and the oil companies.
Local content refers to policies imposed by government, which requires foreign companies to use goods and services produced by the host country, and usually is a requirement for those foreign companies to operate in that country. Wendell Badri for HGP Nightly News.
You're listening to Caribbean Perspective with Eddie Frederick. What is the agenda of the PCA director? This is a question being asked by top cop Gary Griffith, who notes that the PCA claims to still be in the process of investigating allegations of criminal conduct into Assistant Commissioner of Police Erwin Hackshaw, even though they are unable to produce evidence supporting same. Griffith says the PCA director seems to be responding to public pressure in Trinidad and Tobago for results. Behavior he's calling unprofessional and immature. TV6's Renessa Cutting reports.
The top cop says it was just about 2 weeks ago that he met with the PCA director, who confirmed to him that no evidence of criminal conduct was found on the part of ACP Erwin Hackshaw. What was found was evidence of possible breaches of the Police Service Regulations 133 and 150, which speak to officers undertaking paid private work without approval. Such action, Griffith points out, does not constitute criminal behavior. The top cop notes that despite this, the PCA, in press releases dated August 21st and 22nd, stated that an investigation into criminal offences is at this time nearing completion. The top cop says it therefore creates the impression that the PCA is on a witch hunt and has ethics of convenience, as unfortunately a precedent has long been set of officers moonlighting in the service, such that almost a quarter of officers must be culpable of this so-called serious police misconduct. But Griffith notes it is something he has clamped down on since coming into office. The police commissioner sought to make it clear, however, that the TTPS has accepted the recommendation by the PCA to proceed with disciplinary proceedings against ACP Hackshaw. But he notes this can only be done via a tribunal where the investigating officer holds an office higher than that of the officer concerned. However, since there are no deputy commissioners of police, the only officer of higher rank is the commissioner himself. But Griffith notes this would mean that he would be the judge, jury, and executioner, which he says is patently illegal. He has since reached out to the Police Service Commission, once again urging the appointment of substantive DCPs. Renessa Cutting, TV6 News.
The UK demands Trinidad and Tobago's nationals to self-quarantine for 14 days.
As the number of COVID-19 cases in TNT continues to rise, the United Kingdom is now requiring anyone travelling from TNT to that country to self-isolate for 14 days after arrival. This takes effect from this coming Saturday. Here in TNT today, the Health Ministry announced 81 new COVID-19 cases. That pushes the number of active cases to 615.
Kamla Prasad-Bisesar, who is to be appointed opposition leader in Trinidad and Tobago once more, says the new cabinet of Dr. Rowley offers no hope for the Twin Island Republic. Joel Brown of TV6 News has more.
On her Facebook page, UNC political leader Kamla Prasad-Bisesar said that the appointment of Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley's cabinet on Wednesday was a chance for his administration to offer some new hope to the citizens. Mrs. Prasad-Bisesar, who is to be reappointed as opposition leader for a second term, described the first term of the Rowley administration as 5 years of suffering for the people of Trinidad and Tobago. She said Prime Minister Rowley repackaged and repurposed his old team, whom she called incompetent ministers, and, in her words, added some recycled ones, quote, with the task to clean up their own mistakes of the past 5 years, end quote. Mrs. Prasad-Bisesar said, quote, sadly, no new hope was offered, end quote. Nonetheless, Mrs. Prasad-Bisesar wished them all the best in the interest of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. She said it was also reckless of the office of the Prime Minister to suggest that some of the ministers appointed are supporting ministers who may or may not attend the cabinet meetings. The office of the Prime Minister said on its Facebook page that contrary to a news report that the cabinet is 22 members, that there are 8 supporting ministers in various ministries who may or may not attend cabinet as required. The UNC leader, who is also a former Prime Minister, said there is simply no provision in the Constitution or Convention which allows for the appointment of ministers who are not members of the Cabinet or which allows some ministers to attend Cabinet as required. Mrs. Prasad-Bisesar said a cabinet like this, as was suggested by the office of the Prime Minister, is illegal, irrational, unlawful, and contrary to our Republican Constitution. Mrs. Prasad-Bisesar said with the reappointment of major ministerial portfolios such as finance, attorney general, and national security, quote, one now wonders who they will continue to blame for their failures as they have been in office for the past 5 years, end quote. She said the opposition UNC will relentlessly hold the government accountable to the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Mrs. Prasad-Bisesar said in the short to medium term, quote, we hope that this new band of ministers can move swiftly to adequately address the basic issues plaguing the population such as unemployment, crime, infrastructural decay, and the decline of the energy sector, end quote. Joel Brown, TV6 News.
I am Eddie Frederick. This has been Caribbean Perspective, a whole new approach to highlighting developments in the Caribbean. In the meantime, please continue to log on to CaribbeanPerspective.com for more daily news and more.